It's illusion.
uma, uma ragô, uma ragô. Do tempo me apareceu um sonho.
travel for the world to teach the people him word, the true word of God. Make people stop to lie, say not lies for the world. If people stop to lie, Benjamin go fool the world. If people stop to lie, if you 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 stop to lie, lie, like if you stop to lie, 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 lie. Now so him go, him carry machine for him modo. Him say him dey go international airport. Him want to travel for the world. Him say him dey confident, yeah. Say him go succeed in mission. Now so him go, go, go. Now so him go, go, go. Go, 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 go. People gather, them come they look am, them rush am doctor, him no fit save am. Mr. Doctor, he no fit save am. Now so truth come die him come clear road for life, now lie like fool be one, like go they jump from mouth, like water rush from pump. The way people they lie, them know they fear them God. The way people they lie, them know they fear them shrine. Them just they lie, oh, oh. Them just they lie, oh, oh. Lie, oh, 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 oh. Lie, oh, oh, oh.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry to interrupt the conversations. The event we're about to partake of is being live streamed, so we don't have any choice in terms of the timing. We're very strict on timing, and we do have to start exactly on 1:30. So I'd encourage you to take a seat, turn off phones, do all those things that you need to do, and we'll be starting very shortly, and we will have to go exactly on time, so I'll just forewarn you of that before we get started.
Start now? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Making Our Voices Heard. My name's Jolie Mitchell, and I am the editor of Stock and Land. Today, we're here to talk advocacy. Agriculture is under heavy scrutiny from every direction. We all know that. and the way we communicate with the rest of the community has been revolutionised in just the last few years. That's why it's so important that we take a fresh and unblinking look at the way we advocate. Two of our major commodities, red meat and dairy, are doing just that. Australian community media has a proud history of connecting agricultural, regional and rural communities. That's why we're so excited to be talking about the future of the way we will all interact. We're incredibly pleased to have such an exceptional panel here today to dissect this topic, and they'll all be introduced to you shortly. But firstly, I'd like to introduce the facilitator of today's event. He's the Deputy Chair of the ACCC, and he's had a lifetime of experience in agricultural policy and advocacy. Please welcome Mick Keogh.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Jolie, and welcome everyone here. For those who are out there in the ether, we probably have 100 or so people here in the audience, and I'm not sure how many we have online, but hopefully we provide you with an interesting hour or so of discussion. I'm going to briefly introduce our panellists. I'll start with Simon Crean. Many of you may know Simon was Leader of the Opposition, President of the ACTU, Minister for a whole range of portfolios. In fact, I think he was one of the few members of Parliament that spent most of their time in Parliament in a ministerial role. I think he walked straight in from day one as a minister, and it was either shadow or minister from then on. So certainly dealt with all sorts of advocacy groups, from local government to the arts to technology and training and primary industries, and then for his sins took on the chairmanship of the Australian Live Exporters Council. So has certainly seen it from the other side. Next to him is Andrew Spencer. Andrew is the just retired CEO of Australian Pork Limited. So Australian Pork Limited is relatively unique in that it is an organisation that is both research and development, but also marketing and promotion, and representative of pork producers. So it's quite a unique model in terms of advocacy structures in Australia. Next to Simon is Fiona Simpson, who's well known, I guess, to a lot of us. Fiona actually got her first burst of advocacy in the Karoona Coal Action Group, and went from there to the New South Wales Farmers, where she was president, and then moved on from there to her current role, which is president of the National Farmers Federation. So quite an experience in advocacy. Next to Fiona is Daniel Mead. Daniel Mead's a dairy farmer and Nuffield scholar, and his Nuffield study was predominantly focused on advocacy groups, how they engage with farmers, and particularly how they extend research and development outcomes to farmers. And I think I'm still correct in saying that apart from his local dairy discussion group, Daniel remains seriously agnostic of farm groups at the moment, unless you've joined up in recent times, Daniel.
Yeah, I'm a member of the You Do That.
He's ruined my pitch, but that's all right. And on this end is David Innall. David's CEO of Australian Dairy Farmers, previously CEO of Cattle Council, also had a role for a time with Meat and Livestock Australia and the New South Wales Dairy Farmers Association, and interestingly spent 4 years in the USA as an executive in the United Egg Producers, which might sound a bit obscure, but I suspect the United Egg Producers in the USA is probably larger than most representative bodies here in Australia, and no doubt David will tell us a little bit about that as we go forward. So what I'm proposing to do to start with is just to engage in a bit of a discussion with our panellists, and I'm going to start with Simon because I think, as his introduction indicated, he's in a very unique position in that he spent quite a period of time from 1985 right through till at least 2010 or a bit later in the engine room of government, so to speak, as either a minister or a shadow minister or as leader of the opposition. So he would have been exposed to quite a range of advocacy groups representing all sorts of interests, and part of his role was obviously to make assessments of their pitch to him and ultimately determine policy and make policy decisions on the basis of the representations, amongst other things, that are put to him. So I suppose my first and obvious question to you, Simon, is, and even going back to the union movement, did you have, or can you think of examples where you saw very well done advocacy and organisations operating very well in terms of their ability to have an input and perhaps even to influence the policy processes? Interested in whether you can, something comes to mind. Was it a local government authority, or was it an arts organisation, or was it in fact primary industries? You had a stint there as minister for a period. What are your thoughts?
I think the essentials are strong leadership and the mob behind you. That means leading the mob, not kowtowing to the lowest common denominator, and not trying to necessarily get a total consensus, but to argue out the case that you think has got most going for it. The most effective mechanism, I think, that made the change for this country was the trade union movement through the Accord. I was president of the ACTU at the time. We had to deal with similar circumstances as farm organisations. We had federation, we were federal unions, but had to become a national voice. And in terms of driving the policy, we were, with a lot of persistence, able to get almost total unanimity as to where we went. And if we didn't get unanimity, isolate the recalcitrants. It's easier to isolate them if you've got fewer of them. Stands to reason, but that was an effective tool. When I became minister, one of the first things I had to do was to set up the cooperative research centres, and that was an interesting example of having to drive a consensus between the universities and industry for collaboration. We still have those issues today, but nevertheless there are mechanisms there to be put in place. And that, again, was an exercise of trying to understand, most importantly, what your objective is and then who you needed to convince. And finally, if you want the agricultural explanation, and it's topical now because of drought, but in 1992 I introduced the first national drought policy for the country, and it was an interesting policy mix because it was about household support. When I was minister, it was then the worst drought. There have been worse since, but it was at that stage the worst drought. We did have farm household support, but fundamentally we also moved to a model that moved away from the rebates on grain and fodder and being moved in to a preparedness for drought, understanding it was an important part of the lifestyle. And we introduced the farm management bond scheme, but we also introduced important training and structural adjustment measures to get people to understand they needed to prepare better. Now, in terms of that exercise, I had to deal with state governments, only one of which was a Labor government. But we got agreement. We got agreement because we were able to share the responsibility, share the commitment in terms of contribution, and share a process that determined who was in need of the exceptional circumstances. Now, I noticed over many years subsequent to that, that's progressively got whittled away, and so we've had crazy examples of recent times where some people are arguing they're getting assistance where they don't need it, and others are destitute and not getting it. Something's wrong with a system that can't make that distinction on objective measures. So, look, my final point would be, I still think what the farm sector has to come to grips with is the fact that it needs to speak in so many industries with a national voice, but your structure is still essentially state-based. You've got to overcome that. And we're going through the exercise in the red meat sector, happy to talk about that later if people want it, where we're trying to move to a structure that recognises there is a whole of supply chain. Don't just treat yourself as agricultural commodity producers. You are producing a trusted brand around the world, and it's trusted because of the capability and skill and the land management techniques that we have here that are second to none, including integrity measure systems. And so we need to understand that this is an industry, and take meat. Until I got back involved in it, I did not realise till then, and it's still the case today, it's the largest manufacturing sector in the country, the red meat sector. It's worth $18 billion. It exports $13 billion, which puts it up amongst. Now, if you add dairy to it, but don't see yourself just as a commodity producer. See the holistic dimension, and you've got to make your pitches to more than just the agriculture minister. You've got to get to the Prime Minister down, trade ministers, which I'm sure NFF does, but also industry minister. But in my view, the industry department has been a significantly diminished department. For the agriculture sector, agri-food, you've got to drive the basis on which you reinforce the importance of what the white paper on agriculture seeks to achieve, and that is seeing this as essential to the whole economy, not just the farm sector.
Thanks for that, Simon. So, Fiona, there you are. That's all you've got to do. Simon's laid it out for you. I suspect there is inherent two challenges in that. One is engagement. How do you get farmers to participate? And the second is agreement. How do you get them to agree and adopt that singular focus that Simon spoke about? So let's start with engagement. I think, for years we've used the kumbaya, let's all stand in a circle and we'll be better off. Do you think that still works?
Look, engagement is absolutely critical, and certainly over the last few years that I've been in the role and Tony Ma's been the CEO, what we've concentrated on doing is, it's all very well to focus on structure, I think, and say everybody needs to be here and we need to be looking like this as a structure. But you sometimes you do that, I think, at the expense sometimes of trust, and the expense of people taking responsibility, and the expense of people knowing where they're going. So I think the first thing that we needed to do when we came into the room 3 years ago was, first of all, to focus on what our role was. So why was the NFF established, and what is our purpose? Why are we meant to be here, and what are we doing? And so when we started dissecting all of those things, then we could actually nut out some of the issues that we should be looking at more clearly. We actually focused right down. We used to have 13 committees. We focused it right down to 6. We were able to engage our members in the discussions about those things. And more importantly, encourage then people, if our purpose was to lead Australian agriculture, which is what our new strategy says, then we need to concentrate on bringing people into the room, on building trust within that room, and then finding that there actually are some commonalities and some shared outcomes in that room. So just this morning I was doing a podcast in The Guardian around some of the difficult issues that we've been dealing with lately, some of the really complex issues, issues such as climate change, issues such as drought, issues such as energy. And I'm really, really proud that we have been able to reach a consensus position on all of those issues and bring out a policy on all of those issues. Now, sometimes our members' policies differ slightly from the NFF's position, but that's absolutely fine. I mean, what we need is a single position that we can prosecute in Canberra. Simon's quite right. So yesterday, those of you who follow me on Twitter will see that we were sitting down with the Prime Minister, Minister McCormack, Minister Littleproud, talking drought. But just as equally, we sit down with Minister Susan Lee to talk about environment, sitting down with Simon Birmingham on Monday to talk about trade. So there's a whole heap of different ministers that we have to engage with. And it's really, really critical that we can actually do it in terms of a unified voice. So things aren't quite as staid anymore around the NFF table. We tend not to have too many foreshadowed motions and movers and seconders and things like that. We do tend to focus on the committees, which is where our members are engaged, so that policy committees, and, you know, it's those issues that we really do need our members' engagement, and through them to the farmers. And so I'm really worried.
I know you could wax lyrical, but I'm going to challenge you a bit because, of course, in the same way that the union movement has experienced difficulty in maintaining participation, in the absence of participation in farm groups, those sentiments which you express are very difficult to deliver. So what do you think on that question?
So our direct members are our members' organisations, not the farmers.
So it's not your responsibility?
So no. So it's really, so we try, with a lot of our initiatives, we work through our members to touch farmers, and we encourage our members to actually engage more with the farming community and to encourage membership of farming organisations. And so we also initiate a number of programs such as our Diversity in Leadership, our 2030 Leaders, where the whole 2030 roadmap, where we are actively going out into the farming regions and talking to farmers and engaging and encouraging them, I think, to see the value of advocacy groups. And I'm really quite comfortable and confident that at the moment we've got a very strong voice, but it always needs to change and evolve. It certainly does, but it also needs the ownership of the grassroots farmers to do that. And so we need to work through at the moment with the way that the structure the way it is. We can help our members, and we certainly want to do that. But we also need to encourage, you know, our members to embrace that as well.
Okay, I'm going to come to you, David Innall, because in your experience, in particular in advocacy organisations, you've had three, so certainly ADF and Cattle Council, where you could argue that the focus has more been on the structure than the strategy. And then you had the experience, obviously, in the US, where there was a very clear focus in terms of the salmonella or whatever the disease. Avian influenza crisis was. So does that give you a picture about whether strategy matters, or do you have to have structure before you get strategy? Because I suspect to the average farmer the structure arguments are just white noise that make no sense at all.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. Just by way of some background in terms of where I worked in the United States, the structure was a direct membership structure. And the US egg industry is really quite unique in that it's a real poster child of consolidation of farmers. In the 80s, there was 10,000 egg farmers. There's now 140 commercial egg farmers. So we could get 95% of production meeting in this room. 10,000 to 140. And some of those, our largest member was twice Australia's production on their own. So these are big businesses, and they pay large sums of money as a direct membership fee for a service. And when they call, we respond. But they were very polite about it. But when, for example, when avian influenza hit in April 2015, it's the largest exotic disease emergency ever to hit the United States. It was $1 billion. 42 million birds got euthanised in about 6 or 8, a couple of months. What I saw there, which I was very impressed with, and maybe the direct membership model assisted, but I think there's a slightly different outlook, is that they just rallied together. There was tears, and there was a lot of people under a lot of pressure, and the USDA was driving around the country involved in euthanising these flocks, but everybody focused on, I think they're very good at knowing exactly what they need to achieve, and they focused on that. Back to your question around structure, that we do have that history of the federated structure, which has been covered already, and I think why that's important and has served us well is that many of the laws that affect a farmer day to day, environmental, food safety, animal welfare, are state laws. So that's important that there's representation at that level. In terms of engagement, I think it's just building that connection between what's happening at your state level and making sure we can stitch that together in a narrative that works in Canberra is not always easy. One of my kind of pet topics that keeps me awake at night is we talk a lot as an advocacy organisation about setting policies, and we've got heaps of policies on animal disease and Johne's disease, whatever it is, we have policies on them and we can grab them. Like a big fruit tree, we can grab a policy and say, yes, if the government asks a question, we can respond and say, this is our policy, or we support NFF's policy, or whatever that is. How do we actually grab all of those pieces and turn it into solutions and strategies for farmers to actually be more profitable and manage risk? That's the part we're missing.
But and perhaps we can blame the media, and given that we're the hosts of the media here, that may not be quite appropriate. But it seems that the media focuses on structural battles. Is UDV threatening to pull out of ADF? Will farmer power derail the dairy levy? So why is it that seems to be the predominant noise that most farmers hear about advocacy organisations rather than the strategy issues? Yeah.
So I think in any of these issues, there's the human side that becomes almost more interesting, and certainly when there's any rumblings in an organisation, which always happens, from time to time, they tend to get attention. It becomes newsworthy. We do what we can to obviously answer the questions, but to pivot that into opportunity for reform or improvement, and we can always do that. But yes, not exactly sure what else to say other than there is for 20 years. I mean, the red meat industry restructured in 1999 with the formation of Meat and Livestock Australia, and some changes there, and they've now just gone through that again. And we as was referenced at the top end of this discussion, is through our dairy plan, is also having a structural discussion as to what is the most effective, how does the money flow work, and what's the best way in which we can fund these organisations, and how do we make sure that the structure is working for everybody, and most importantly, how do farmers feel like they can be involved and have a say?
Andrew, not surprising on that note that I would come to you. I suspect many would suggest that APL, Australian Pork Limited, was the poster child, because one structure, one organisation, no hint of internal politics, or at least nothing that gets out of the sealed boardroom doors, and very singular voice to government. But I'm sure it can't have all been rosy, and of course the counter-argument is, well, you're tied to the government's purse strings, because if you didn't have the levy, you wouldn't have membership, or you wouldn't have an organisation. So tell us a bit about your experience now that you're not in the chair. Tell us a bit about the wins and losses associated with that structure.
Yes, Mick, as you know, it's a unique structure. The difference that Australian Pork Limited has in its statutory funding agreement is that it mentions strategic policy development, and that's not really a good description for the extra responsibilities that we had, which was actually industry representation, and it included advocacy. But as for all of the research and development corporations, it had a specific clause banning us from participating in any agri-political activities. If you have a close look at the document, though, it doesn't really tell you what agri-political activities are. It tells you what is not an agri-political activity, and I think that's a crux to some of the arguments that are getting around at the moment. What is an agri-political activity? We had various opinions from agricultural ministers over my 14-year tenure in the role. For example, Tony Burke, when he was Agriculture Minister, my impression was he didn't like our model, because he said two things about it, which from a purist point of view is probably true. Firstly, we were a compulsory lobby organisation, so people who paid levies were in effect members, and that shouldn't happen. The second one was, as a lobbying organisation with access to government money, that's a no-no. You should not have those sort of connections. Now, from a purist point of view, both of those have some merit. And so within APL, we had to manage the way we did things so that we didn't abuse how we'd been given those responsibilities, and that we actually did work on behalf of the industry in a responsible manner with the wishes of our stakeholders, levy payers behind us, or members, if you want to call them that. And at the same time, not abuse the fact that we've got access to matching funding. And it really affected mainly the policy process. So policy research is something that I believe all research and development corporations should be participating in. And should be directed or helped decide what the key issues for research are through their representative bodies. That evidence generated is passed on for policy development, so that's when the industry comes up with its position. So that is something that typically falls into the responsibilities of an industry representative body. Then you have the advocacy, which is where you take your evidence-based policy position to those who have influence over legislative instruments, etc., and you argue the case for it. And you do so on the basis of fact and evidence and feedback. And if all fails, it tends to be my thought, if all fails, then if you have the ability, you go to the agri-political activities, because that's where you're doing something very different. You're actually, instead of making a representation to a regulator or a politician, you're making a representation almost to a voter about who's right and who's wrong in the political process. So that's something we couldn't do. There's an argument, I think, that in the 21st century, if you have to get to that point, you've sort of lost the argument a little bit anyway. And that's why I think the APL model worked. We took it as our challenge to use strong evidence basis to get good national interest policies for our industry.
But during your tenure, there were certainly periods when, for example, strident opposition within the industry was voiced to pork imports. Surely you must have had to pull your punches when you went to see the minister.
Yeah, that's right. There were many controversial subjects during my tenure, as there is, I'm sure, for others on the panel. You know, it's a really tough job. There are moments in a CEO's life for an industry representative body where you face the choice of doing what you really believe is right for the industry long term, or doing what you think is actually the easiest way to get through the next week. And to my pride, APL always went the former way, and it put us in a lot of short-term strife, but I think it's put the industry in a lot of positive positions now.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to come to you now, Daniel. You're not in the family, so to speak, in terms of being actively engaged in some of the higher levels of organisations. You are, as you said, a grassroots member, but you did spend quite a deal of time travelling overseas in, I think, 5 or 6 different countries, looking at how their advocacy and to some extent their extension and research organisations worked. Having heard this discussion, what are the lessons you picked up in that Nuffield work that you did?
Yeah, thanks, Mick. Look, your spiel there was correct. When I undertook my Nuffield study, I was keen to be independent of any organisation. My Nuffield report ended up recommending that people join up, so I thought I'd better.
You followed your own advice.
Exactly. So, yeah, I went to 6 different countries. I went to about 25 to 30 different organisations, and of those organisations, I managed to interview at least 1 or 2 members from each of those organisations, plus members that were eligible but decided, or non-members, farmers that were eligible but decided not to. So what I found was a strength for those that had strong engagement levels was face-to-face contact. I think there can be an over-reliance on written communication, including social media, Twitter profiles, etc., etc. So those that had real strength and greater weight and percentage in engagement knew the person they could go to for an issue they had for their industry or the wide agriculture industry. They knew who they were in their local towns. So decentralised representation, I found, was a strength in the places I visited. So, and that was not only your local representative that you elected, but also local paid field officers and territory managers for that staff. So Farmers Union in Wales, for example, had about 1 officer per 230 odd members. So really strong representation there, and they were about 67% of their demographic. They represented Farmers Union of Wales, and that was voluntary membership. So face-to-face was the key for that. Also, I found that farmers, leading farmers, so farmers elected by farmers, was another one that people have the opportunity to vote in their directly vote in their leaders. So once again, NFU done this quite well. They had regional forums and they go to the local town hall, the local soccer club, stand up there on the stage and put forward their position as why the grassroots member should elect them.
For the audience, the NFU is the UK Farmers Organisation.
Sorry, yeah, National Farmers Union. So I found that I actually went to one of those, and they really got the crowd captivated, enthralled. And I was talking to people in the crowd that night that weren't members, but were there and still had a chance to sign up if they wanted to, but could see who would be representing them on the national level. What I also found as another opportunity to engage not only just your farmers but broaden the net. I think if Australian agricultural representative bodies relies on purely farmers to represent, they will continue to decline because obviously our farmer numbers are declining. So I think broadening the net of people who can join and support Australian farming and Australian agriculture will assist spread the positive word of agriculture, and will also provide extra weight in advocacy when going to ministers, etc., to have that weight behind you. So it's not only the farmers, but as we all know, small rural towns survive on the cows and the sheep's back. So if agriculture is struggling, the whole community will be struggling, as we're finding out now in some parts of Australia. So why can't they contribute to our advocacy as well? Because it's directly beneficial to them.
It's an interesting observation some have made that those countries where there's a lot of government involvement in agriculture, farmers tend to get more involved, and certainly if you go back prior to our deregulation in sort of 94 to 2008, there was a lot more focus on whether it was arguing about the floor price or the quotas for milk or etc., and that engaged a lot of farmers. I'm interested in your observations, whether you think, and it's a bit hard to judge, I know, but the second one I'm interested in is you talked about face-to-face and direct. Do you think for farmers on the ground, some of these policy issues are all a bit up there, but a local field day or a local training day on chemical use, etc., is probably more likely to attract membership than an argument about what's happening to a dairy code in Parliament at the moment?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Mick. I think, look, as we know, an iceberg was nothing without its base. So base is where it all starts, grassroots is where it all starts. If you don't have that, you have nothing. So grassroots branches, they need to be maintained and encouraged, because that's often the first entry point for ag advocacy. People go there because they've got local issues, they know someone who's there, they often know the local, or they should know the local leader. They'll have opportunity to have a direct input. So for people to become engaged, they must be confident that their opinions will be heard and listened to and appreciated. And I think that's where it starts, grassroots level.
Okay, we've got, as I said to our online audience, we've got about 100 people here in the audience. We've got a little bit of time in front of us, but I'm keen to hear any questions from the audience if there are any, but I will restrict you to some degree in that, for the benefit of our online audience, it's no good yelling out without a microphone. So we will come to that. I think we'll get that organised shortly, but we will come to some questions. So if you've been thinking about it, in the next few minutes we'll get there. I'm going to throw to the panel, we could take from this conversation that everything's rosy, everything's hunky-dory, and there's not a problem, that agriculture is well advocated for, and any issue that comes up the sector could deal with. Simon, do you think that's right?
I don't, but again, I think we talked about structures before. I think the industry has been held back by an overlay of structure that's either taken as read and not questioned. Now, I want to come to this question of agri-political activity. I don't accept that what the industry is getting is government money. The levy is the members, is paid by either the producer, the processor, the exporter. I think there's a distinction when it comes to R&D because there are matching funds for that, and there is an entitlement for government being a contributor to that component. But I think that you've got to ask the question seriously about the effectiveness of organisations and how well they represent their grassroots, because I believe that the membership structure should be around the grassroots. You'll have to come back up through collegiate systems and all sorts of things. Everyone will have their own. But I think that there is a serious question here that if you've undertaken the research, if you've undertaken the strategic direction, why shouldn't you be able to advocate in a bipartisan sense for what is sound policy? I don't accept that the model that should be pursued in that direction is giving more strength to the RDC, because a lot of the issues that happen within the industry are the tension between the RDC and the membership body. I would like to see the amalgamation model, and what Andrew has talked about I think is an interesting question, but it denies them the ability to involve in agri-political. Now, there are a couple of ways around that. You can look at international models that do. You can use voluntary levies if it's the levy system that's going to be the barrier to fund the agri-political. But why not question the fundamental issue? It's members' money. Through properly structured organisations, they should be able to allocate it in a way, and only in relation to R&D where there's matching should there be something of a barrier around it. But there should be anyway. The R&D money should be for establishing the scientific base, should be establishing the evidence base, because that's what you've got to base your advocacy on. I think the most important point I would make is if you're going to advocate on the facts, and don't be frightened of the facts. Don't just do it out of rhetoric or assertion. Evidence is the proper basis. You need the R&D, you need the matching dollars, but organisations need to face up to what constitutes agri-political.
And it's interesting, your comments, because of course it's worth observing that in South Australia, the representative organisations there are the subject of an opt-out levy, which is largely complied with. Fiona, you obviously had some comments around that.
Yeah, I was actually just going to make that point. I think that one of the confusing things in Australian advocacy is the complexity of all the different models. So we've got APL over there, who is unique in the way that it's structured. We also have South Australia that has a voluntary levy compulsorily collected but can be got back if you don't want to do it. Then we have the R&D structure generally, where those organisations are not able to participate in, even most of them are not able to participate in marketing, other than MLA, which has a separate, it's all extraordinarily complicated. And I just want to make sure that everybody's aware that right now, because I think part of the difficulty of engaging grassroots people, like Daniel says, and I totally agree, I'm a huge advocate for regional groups, regional representation, and making sure people really feel that they have links through their organisation to the things that matter. But part of the problem at the moment is that the R&D system is a little disconnected sometimes from some of the representative groups, and therefore the people on the ground are not seeing those direct links. And that's sometimes because they're a bit obtuse. It's a bit unclear. So at the moment there is an R&D review in Australia. The Minister Bridget McKenzie has announced that, and it's really, really important that everybody has a really good think, and that those who have strong views do have their say, because this is an opportunity to really have a look at the outcomes that art research should be pursuing in terms of how you link those up to the needs of the communities, of the farming communities and the levy payers, the people who put those monies into those organisations, and also then the extension. So with research and development, of course, it's all very well to do the science, but then you have to actually make sure that people are adopting and innovating on farm. And without those good connections, then that doesn't happen. So right now, great opportunity, keep your eye on that, because you do need to have input into that review. And it's a great opportunity for us, I think, to put our money where our mouth is and to try and design a better system.
Okay. Thank you for that, Fiona and Simon. I'm going to look at the audience and see whether we've got any questions. If you wouldn't mind just putting your hand up. If you have got a question, there you go. I think we've got one in the front row. I will ask you to put a name to yourself and an organisation if that's what you're representing or what you do, and as indicated, make sure you're talking to the microphone because the online audience won't hear you otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Mick. Loretta Carroll from Cattle Producers Australia. We've had 2 Senate inquiries, one in 2014, one in 2017, all indicating that we need democratic representation and all farmers being represented in the cattle industry, grass-fed cattle industry. Both those Senate inquiries the government didn't back, and I just wonder how many Senate inquiries to start with. Firstly, you're asking for reviews now with the research and development. Yep, there is, I realise that, but it seems to me that we have a lot of reviews, a lot of farmers put in submissions, and they went on another tangent, didn't look at the actual representation, a democratic representation. So firstly, and also in 2016, AFI report came out and said there is scope to use levies for representation, and as the Pork Limited has already done that, AMPC, live exporters do that to a degree. So why is there an issue with cattle production, cattle producers, and why can't we, I mean, it's pretty simple, it's not rocket science, is it, to have every cattle producer be a member of an organisation that represents that gives them a say in the levies and how those levies are spent.
Who wants to try that one?
I'll briefly, because I've already had a say, but then I'll move it on. So briefly, I think that's what this review, so Bridget McKenzie's quite open to everything being on the table, which includes coupling some sort of advocacy with levies. So there you go. But I also think that there is a responsibility too for farmers. So what farmers tend to do in my experience, and this might be a big generalisation, is that if they don't like what the organisation that is meant to be representing them does, that they start another one. And so unfortunately what that means is that you end up with a myriad of voices and a myriad of organisations similar to the roadmap of advocacy organisations that we have in Australia today. And certainly around the NFF table at the moment we're encouraging the most diverse voices we can possibly have. As Daniel said, we're widening our view. We're about leading Australian agriculture, so we have members around the table who are not farmers, who are farmers. They all have, because we're a bit bound by the Constitution, we all have different rights and things, but we seem to overlook all that and we all just get on and we all talk about the issues in front of us. So I think farmers too, when we can have Senate inquiries, we can have government telling us what to do, but at the end of the day, we have a responsibility to get involved too, and if we want to make change, you change it from within and get involved and get engaged and sort of resist trying to set up new organisations with like-minded people around you, because that's ultimately not going to affect change in the people that you need to affect it to. Who wants to go? David, you were ex-Cattle Council.
So I certainly endorse everything that Fiona's just said, and there's been plenty of Senate inquiries. There's the 2 that you referred to. We're about to go through another one. The government isn't necessarily obligated to enact recommendations from a Senate inquiry. That's another piece to this. We've got farming organisations that have been around 40, 50, 60, 70 years that have established, this might sound like a bureaucratic answer, but that have established constitutions and that I am employed by, that have a membership base that's well established. Other groups start up for their own reason, and I don't criticise that, but groups get going, and therefore they try and make change from outside, and as Fiona has just said, absolutely, it's very difficult. The harsh reality is that if the Prime Minister or the Minister for Agriculture or the Minister for Trade needs to do something very fast and wants to talk to an organisation, they will talk to those people who can very quickly get a network going and can come back with some type of cogent response. We need to know in an hour this. Can you tell us something? And I'd ring Fiona and say, get back to us on this. We're about to make an announcement. Or I've just had a phone call about, I've lived through an exotic disease incident when the Chief Vet of the United States rings and says, we need to talk to you. They need to talk to an organisation that can very quickly, in our case, we got 300 people on a telephone in an hour. People from the White House, journalists, everybody, we could do that. Now, unless you've had that structure, then You know, if you're a smaller group, with all due respect, you probably can't pull that together, and then the government says, well, we're about to spend $1 billion, we need to talk to somebody who can help.
Okay, question, just to make it hard for the microphone carrier, right at the front. Don't forget your name.
My name's Bernard Lubitz. I'm a dairy farmer in South Gippsland and I don't represent anybody. Respect. Before we can get members, we need respect. Bit of history. Prior to the NFF, we had the Country Party representing farmers. And then if you do a bit of reading, which I did sort of virtually what, sorry, David did as a, Daniel, sorry, my apologies, as a same thing, but post-Farmgate about industry structures. Every 20 years when technology changes and society changes, we get a change of industry structures roughly, if you look back. When the NFF was brought together, you had two different views of the world. You had the farmers and graziers that were free marketers, and then you had farmers that were, you know, regulated, commodity-based. We wanted subsidies. And we finally got the NFF together, but the groups never trusted the NFF, didn't think it was going to last, so they kept their own name structures and everything, and we keep doing that, and we can't talk with one voice, so we have to decide whether we're going to speak with one voice. So, and I'm not seeing that. Everyone's got slightly different views of the world and what we're doing, and Red Meat's doing what they're doing. Farmers don't understand how this all comes together. The dairy industry is about to decide to pull the pin and walk away, and we're going to do it all ourselves. So structures are important. And I don't think grassroots are what you think grassroots are from your vantage point, from living in around it. You're not going to get change from the grassroots anymore. We're looking for leadership, and until we see leadership that is driving results, I'm disinclined to want to be a member of anything because I'm not seeing it going anywhere. I'm just hearing the same white noise about issues. I don't think the culture in Australian ag can be mirrored in what we see in overseas countries. There's just a different culture in the way we work together and how we communicate. So you can't replicate what's going on over there here. It just doesn't work, I don't think, anymore.
I think, can you
just
keep it to a question?
So I think structure's very important. Right now we have to decide, are we going to give away our individual identities and work with the NFF and trust each other, or are we going to finish with the NFF and focus on our individual commodities? And I say that in regards to this industry doesn't have a plan. We say we want to grow the industry, but we don't have a structure to make that happen. We haven't got a coordinated approach to do it. We have independent voices.
I'm going to pull you up there, Bernard, and let anyone in the audience who wants to respond, anyone in the panel who wants to respond, have a go to that, because I am conscious of our time.
Just one point I'd make, and you mentioned that you're not satisfied with the bodies who could be representing you, so you're not a member of them. I'd like to just throw another alternative to you, is that if you're not satisfied with the bodies that you could be a member of, join up and have your say and change them from within, as Fiona was saying. That's really what we need in Australian agriculture. Not at all.
Mick, we've got some
something online
questions as well.
So David, you want to have a go?
Yeah.
Okay, and then we'll go to an online question. David, have a quick... Okay, let's go to the online question.
This one's come from a dairy farmer in Carpendite. Her name's Kath Jenkins. She's asked, what will be the process to ensure all options in the reform process are seriously considered? And what will be the actual process? Okay to have great ideas for a better structure, but how does industry go about choosing and implementing them?
I think that's probably directed at you anyway, David.
Can you address whether you're leaving NFF at the same time?
So I probably do need to just get back to before I get to Kath's question. I'm not sure where that came from. There's no suggestion that dairy is going it alone. Dairy is a proud member of NFF, and what NFF does I think is quite clear is a lot of that cross-commodity work, whether it's drought, whether it's telecommunications, whether it's trade, whether it's tax reform and so on, industrial relations. So that's clear. We don't have the resources to get into all of those pillars, but I think every industry should proudly understand and prosecute its own specific policy initiatives that are relevant to each sector. And NFF would expect us to do that. They don't want to get into the minutiae of our industry. In terms of the question that's been asked online around dairy plan, so there is, just by quick context, there is a transition team that is currently meeting, currently as in working through a few-month process to come up with a number of options, somewhat similar to what we've seen in red meat. There is an expectation that committee will come up with a shortlisted number of options. Let's say it's sort of 2 or 3 or 4. I don't think that needs to be too specific right now. They may come forward with a preferred option. That report will be delivered to the 4 partner organisations which are currently overseeing the dairy plan. And those 4 partner organisations will then communicate with industry, and those steps aren't exactly identified, but they will communicate with industry as to how we best have an open dialogue with what all those options are, what the implications are. Those partners may well have a preferred model themselves, but there is certainly no sense that there will be a closed-door discussion and identify a model, because ultimately the 4 partner organisations aren't empowered to tell state farming organisations what their future looks like, or tell us what our future looks like. I mean, this has to be industry stepping forward together. And one of my favourite phrases, Mick, is people support what they help build. And we need to step forward on this, and it's going to take some time.
Okay. I'm aware that some of our panel members in particular have very hard deadlines. So what I've done is I've given them each a challenge question, and I'm going to read it out quickly, just so you understand it, and I'm going to get short answers from each of them in response to it. So the year is 2022. The EU, China and the USA have negotiated a multilateral greenhouse emission strategy, and by that you must infer that I've anticipated a change in leadership in the US, but under which they have agreed to impose a 50% tariff on all imports from developed nations, including Australia, that have not adopted policies to reduce greenhouse emissions by 30% from 2020 levels within 5 years. The Productivity Commission has completed a detailed economic analysis, which has concluded that the least cost way for Australia to achieve that target is to halve current livestock numbers, ban the use of nitrogen fertiliser, ban clearing of trees on farmland, and require all farm businesses to establish a minimum of 30% permanent forest cover on their land. The Australian Government has developed draft legislation to give effect to these measures and obtained the reluctant agreement of all the state governments to implement it. So my 2 questions are, given current agricultural advocacy structures and arrangements, do you think the agriculture sector could successfully respond to this challenge? And secondly, what needs to happen to optimise the way the sector could respond in the future? And just to give you context, those matters that I spoke are not dissimilar to some of the measures being proposed in Holland as we speak, and which has triggered some sort of response from the farm sector. So I know we haven't got much time, Andrew. 2 questions. Could agriculture respond in a way that's satisfactory for the sector? And what needs to happen to allow it to better respond into the future?
Well, Mick, clearly the Productivity Commission's been doing a lot of work, and they've made some recommendations that would make our country look pretty un-Australian. So the agricultural industries would, of course, need to respond, and I'm sure they'd have their own take on what needed to happen. But clearly there's a hell of a lot of evidence required to argue with someone like the Productivity Commission.
But the miners have all agreed wholeheartedly with it, and all the consumers have as well, because of course they don't want electricity or fuel prices to go up.
All the more reason that we need our own arguments based on our own information.
So could we respond?
We could, but we'd need better structures around policy research. I'm a great advocate for policy research at the RDCs, and we're not doing that well enough yet.
Simon, I'll go to you.
I think parts of the industry could. I mean, if you take the cattle industry, it's made a commitment to carbon neutrality by 2030.
So they could use that as a buffer, if you like, or an
I
argument.
think the people who are showing best endeavours should always be exempted from overreaching arguments. But I think this is where the industry has to come together in terms of its R&D and its advocacy, because what we haven't got is government policy on effectively reducing the targets. We've got targets, and we've got a silly debate about targets, but no one's really talking about how you're going to reduce it. So I think that there are big issues for the industry. I do not understand why there hasn't been stronger argument for carbon farming initiatives and support for it. There is bipartisanship for this. It was around when I was in government, and we did a number of things, including in the meat processing sector, to make a closed loop operation in terms of processing activity. There's huge opportunity in terms of soil generation, in terms of impact. So I think
you're positive. You think the sector could manage it?
It must, but
Well-
it's got to lift the pace in which it's advocating for this. I
Okay.
think it's got a lot of foundations for it, but I'm not hearing a lot of it, to tell you the truth.
Okay. Fiona?
Look, we'd have to respond, and we would. And I think we're actually quite well placed, although I agree with Simon that I think a better link between R&D and advocacy is
You've got
what's
the
really
Productivity
needed.
Commission. It's said that
Absolutely, and we
these
like
are the cheapest
Productivity
emissions.
Commission
We can
usually.
get them easily.
Well, see, well, we've
it's only
also
a few
got
farmers, not many of them vote.
Right now, we've got a $30 million pilot about to be announced, looking at biodiversity and how that's achieved on farmland, and perhaps and natural capital as well, and whether or not we reward farmers for some of that instead of using the big stick.
So do you think the farm sector would get the number of tractors the Dutch farmers have in the main street?
Certainly not. But I think we do need to concentrate on the best structures. And in terms of the NFF, just to clarify, I mean, it is the sum of its parts. So it is a unified voice. We do come together as one voice, but it is only the sum of its members. So we would have to respond, and I'm confident we could step up, but we could have better structures that would make it much more effective if we did that.
Daniel, would you be confident your leaders could get us out of that? Halving your herd, that wouldn't hurt you, would it?
Well, look, Mick, I reckon to be successful in advocacy, and I think Simon, as a previous agriculture minister, would understand that you've got the industry coming to you for a request or an ask or a policy position. If that industry is divided in itself, it's very easy for that minister to say go away and come back later when you've united in your own front. So I think to be successful in advocacy, that's got to happen. And to optimise the way it happened, I think this is one example of, at the moment, we are facing battles on several fronts in farming, in agriculture, from different anti-farming groups, from climate, etc. So if this happens in the future, as the potential is, there's no more reason, there shouldn't be a better reason to actually join up your local organisation and get involved.
The chicken might create the egg, so to speak.
Well, the way to be successful is to have more weight behind the numbers and more farmers to be framers.
David, how would the dairy industry go?
I know I need to be quick.
Half
Mick.
as many cows, that'd be good.
So firstly, thankfully, there's a lot of Australian Farm Institute research that will help us guide the way, Mick. So we appreciate that. I don't think we are well enough ready for that. And I tell you what I know is to look forward, just have to look back. And we've had a lot of trouble coming to landing places on issues that are far simpler than that. So if you've struggled to deal with simple things, how do you deal with what you've just laid out? I think this really comes down to that fundamental question of getting the money right, making sure it's simpler, it's easy to be involved, and we're funded through a different model. And therefore, you have that streamlined communication back through farmers. We've got, as Simon mentioned, I know with dairy, we have these fantastic sustainability platforms, but we need to have that communication better back with farmers so they're involved, they know what we're doing. But coming up with a unified position is almost impossible on those complex things, but we can get there if it's done differently.
Okay, I think we've got about a minute left. I think John wants to say a few words, and I'm sure he'll thank our panellists, but I'll hand over to John.
Thanks very much, Mick, and thank you everyone in the room, and thank you everyone online. Stock and Land every day tells stories about agriculture, and they're stories that often have a production focus. So it's fantastic today to have a group of panellists storytellers in their own right who've put the focus on advocacy and the message that agriculture needs to represent internally and externally. I wanted to thank you, each and every one of you, starting with Andrew. Thank you, Simon, also for your time, Fiona, Daniel, and my good mate, David. Thank you again. And to Mick, as our MC, appreciate your time and energy, expertise, and challenging our panellists. Thanks again, one and all, for being a part of today.
And look, I'd just like to say thanks to Stock and Land for putting it together and giving the opportunity for this to be brought to head and have a good discussion about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel.